The terms right-wing and left-wing have been used in so many different contexts these days that they scarcely seem to mean anything at all. But I believe that beneath this apparent fracturing, right-wing and left-wing are coming to denote two different worldviews, two different understandings of the world. And once you understand these two underlying worldviews upon which people are basing their assumptions, everything becomes a lot clearer. The terms right-wing and left-wing come from the French Revolution. In the French National Assembly, those on the left side of the chamber supported the abolition of monarchy, they supported the revolution, and they supported democratic reforms, while those on the right side were in favor of monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church. Since then, there have been many attempts at defining what right and left-wing really mean. Hierarchy versus equality, collectivism versus individualism. But no matter which of these superficial definitions you choose, you will always be able to find a counter example. It's a confusing mess, and yet we keep using these terms, right-wing and left-wing, and I think that's because we know unconsciously that we are invoking two separate worldviews, two separate sets of first principles, which we can sense intuitively, but we have not yet defined. And I think I know what they are. I believe that the difference between right-wing and left-wing, or perhaps better put, progressivism and traditionalism, can be understood through looking at two ancient ideas, ancestry and fate. And now that may seem obscure and far removed from our time at first, but I promise you if you give me a minute to explain, it will make sense. The idea of ancestry was central to the European pagan worldview, the one seen in Homer and in the Norse sagas. The basic idea is that you have an obligation both to your ancestors and to your descendants, that you receive something important and of worth from your ancestors which you will pass on to your descendants, and that you are connected in a meaningful way to both your ancestors and those who will come after you. And when you understand this, a lot of the rest of the ancient European pagan worldview makes sense. The hero seeks out glory, immortal, eternal fame, and in doing so, he brings honor to his ancestors and also to his descendants. He brings honor to his bloodline, to his family, to his clan, and he achieves a form of immortality because his name will be passed down the generations. His story will be told over and over again, and he will in a sense then be reborn through the generations, preserved through the generations, passed down through the generations. His glory, his name, his fame, his deeds will never die. This is linked to the idea of ancestry as a chain of being. This is the idea which we see expressed in the hymn to Demeter and the myth of Persephone, which I've talked about at length in other videos. I believe that Nietzsche was correct when he pointed out in Twilight of the Idols that the secret of the Greek mystery rites can be found in the idea of the immortality of biological life, the immortality of biological life through reproduction. In spite of death, each season the plants are reborn, and in spite of death, each generation, men are reborn. Persephone again and again emerges out of Hades, out of the earth, out of the place of death, and with her she brings a rebirth of biological life. And connected to this is the celebration of youth and all its markers, beauty, strength, vitality, fertility, grace, because they are markers of the endurance, the immortality of life which is reborn again and again, each generation in the youth. Their entire worldview was linked to this most ancient idea of ancestry as a chain of being. And now let's look at what happens if you don't believe that you are meaningfully connected to your ancestors or to your descendants. You would no longer have a duty to reproduce because you don't owe anything to your ancestors or the chain of descent which has led to you. There would be no duty to preserve or enrich your culture which has been passed down to you because you exist as an isolated individual. You are not connected to your ancestors or to the culture which came before you. And I want you to take this viewpoint seriously for a moment. Imagine that all you have is your finite lifespan. Well, what would you then do with your life? Firstly, I'd say it's probably logical to seek what makes you happy, to seek comfort, because what else are you going to do? You just have your life, and then that's it. It's over. Nothing before or after matters. So nihilistic hedonism is a perfectly logical conclusion of this belief. But of course, people are naturally inclined to seek out meaning. So if you have a moral impulse, you're going to try to remove suffering from as many people's lives as possible. Everyone is here on this earth with this finite life, so you're going to try to make it so that as many people as possible can enjoy their lives in comfort, in pleasure, that they can find happiness, that they can avoid suffering. This is also perfectly logical. In the ancient world, it is in early Christianity that we actually see the first movement away from this ancestral way of thinking towards a more individualistic, messianic way of thinking. In Christianity, what matters is the salvation of the individual soul. This is why in Galatians, Paul says that there is no Greek and no Jew, no male and no female, no slave or free man in Christ. You're all one in Christ. Your nationality, ethnicity, gender, caste, status does not matter anymore. What matters is the salvation of your individual soul. This is why in Matthew, Jesus says that families will be turned against each other because of belief in him, and why he says if you are persecuted in one land, you should flee to another. This is a radical departure from the ancient ancestral way of thinking, which we see all across the globe, and it is especially a radical departure from the European pagan worldview, which Christianity in part developed against in contrast to. Because in the European pagan worldview, family is absolutely central. The gods are a family, and all of their sagas and stories are about family and about what can go wrong in a family. Ancestry, kinship, and hospitality were vitally important to the European pagan worldview. But in Christianity, your ancestry doesn't matter so much. Your ancestors might be in hell while you might be saved. Your descendants, if you have them, might be in hell while you are saved. Everyone is their own person, their own individual soul. And further, since early Christianity was a messianic religion, that whole ancestry thing, that whole descent through the ages, none of that matters because the end times are near. And again, this is not necessarily illogical, it's just a different perspective. If you knew that the end times were coming in a year, let's say, and that your immortal soul was either going to go to heaven or to hell, you probably wouldn't be too concerned anymore with ancestry, with passing anything on down the generations, or with preserving your culture, your nation. All of that would just be thrown out the window. And that brings us to the idea of fate. In the European pagan worldview, everyone's life is fated, and there is some flexibility within that fate. For example, someone might try to avoid their fate and end up coming to their fate in a different way. Someone might have two fates available to them, but fundamentally, your life is fated. And so let's think, how would you act, or how would the ideal way to act be if you believed this? The death of Volsung in the Norse saga of the Volsungs is a perfect example. Volsung married off his daughter Signy to an unsuitable husband. He made a mistake in the realm of family and ancestry. His daughter's husband plans to ambush and kill him, but his daughter warns him of the ambush. Instead of fleeing and returning with an army, he stands alone with his sons against the ambushers. If he was fated to die on that day, then trying to escape would do nothing to change it, and if he was not, then he will emerge victorious. Volsung and all but one of his sons are killed. This is an extreme example of the Norse drengur, a man who meets his fate with courage, honor, and a steadfast, daring will. The European pagan worldview was fundamentally tragic. There are certain immutable laws in nature which cannot be changed, and you can never escape your fate. Life always ends in death, and immortality can only be found through reproduction, through ancestry, and through immortal fame. The European pagan worldview represented a radical embrace of both the harshness and the beauty of the world. If it is necessary to slaughter animals, to eat them and live, then they ritualized it and made the act divine. If it is necessary for all men to die, they sought to do so with honor If life is fundamentally tragic and your fate is inescapable, they sought to conduct themselves with virtue and meet their fates nobly. This is what Nietzsche called amor fati, a radical yes-saying to both the good and ugly parts of life, which necessitate each other, life and death, the pain of childbirth and the new life which it creates, the slaughter of an animal and the nourishment it gives, the harshness and unpredictability of nature, fate, and the gods, and yet the beauty, the blessings, the bounty which they provide, the violence and savagery of human nature, and yet the beauty, excellence, and heroism this nature creates when directed. All of this was celebrated, sanctified, and embraced. Now, the messianic view found in early Christianity and then in later ideologies like communism, like liberalism, all forms of progressivism, is completely opposite to this ancient European pagan worldview. The progressive messianic view is that reality can be fundamentally transformed, that human nature is corrupt and can be bettered, that the world is fallen and can be healed and transformed into a utopia through spiritual, political, or moral means. Now again, it is perfectly logical to see the suffering in the world and the cruelty of human nature and to feel that these things are wrong and believe that they should be somehow transformed. But the question is, can we create a world without suffering? Is it hubris, a pagan idea, to think that we can? We could stop eating animals for nourishment, but we'd still have to eat plants. And then what about all the animals in nature which are predators? If we embrace the world as it is, then instead of trying to transform the world, instead of trying to remove the bad, to remove suffering, and to wage war on the supposed corruption and ugliness of the world, we instead must celebrate the good, which justifies the bad. The beauty of the child justifies the pain and danger of childbirth. The beauty and excellence of the hero in the height of his greatness justifies the fact that he too must die. So if we step back into the present, I would posit that the true first principles of being right-wing, or perhaps more accurately being a traditionalist, are the belief that you are connected to your ancestors and that you have an obligation to perpetuate what you received from them, and the belief that the world and human nature cannot be fundamentally transformed, but that both must be addressed and sanctified as they are. And in contrast, the first principles of leftism or progressivism are the idea that you are an individual who is disconnected from your ancestors and whose only obligation is to seek out happiness in life and perhaps seek to perpetuate the happiness of others, and the belief that the world and human nature are fallen and can be transformed fundamentally into something better. The ideological struggles of modernity are much, much older than you think, and I believe that the solution to our existential problems has already been expressed beautifully, concisely, and thoroughly in the ancient European pagan worldview. If you want to know more about this worldview, I'm making a heroic literature course on Substack in the form of audio episodes, which will cover the European pagan worldview and heroic literature from Homer and the Norse sagas all the way up until Arthurian romance from the late Middle Ages. So if you're interested in that, check the link in the description. Signy came to her father, King Volsung, and asked to speak with him and her brothers in private. She told them that her husband Sigurd had assembled an unbeatable army, and he intended to betray them. "Now I beg you," she said, "return to your kingdom and gather the largest army you can, and then come back here and avenge yourselves. Do not walk into this trap, because you won't fail to be betrayed if you don't do as I ask." Then King Volsung said, "Everyone will say that I swore, while still in my mother's womb, that I would never flee in fear from iron nor from fire, and I have kept that oath all of my days until now, and why would I not keep it in my old age? And no woman will mock my sons, saying that they feared to die. Everyone will die someday, and no one can escape death when his time has come.
To gain access to the ongoing Heroic Literature course and join the ARCS community, check the links in the description.